We do have two configuration files running on a router at any time, and that's one is the startup config and the other is the running config file. Now, depending on how recently you saved your work, the contents of the two files may be the same. I'm particularly retentive about it. I save my changes all the time. But there's a very important difference between these two files when you've configured the router but you haven't yet saved that new configuration. Now, during the boot process, we talked about that. The router looks for that startup config file. If it doesn't find one, it's going to prompt you to go into setup mode. Now, what I'm going to do is a little different than what I've got on the board for you. We're going to just bring router 3 back up, and we're going to run, or actually put a loopback address on it, and then go from there and then take a look at both files. So let's go ahead and bring that router right back up where we were. And I'll just make it all 3s. I like to do that for my lab work. If I'm on router 3, I also like to type correctly, but I certainly wasn't doing it there. And that's it. So let's go ahead then, after we get that little message, and then run show start. And we've got some enable secrets and passwords from an earlier lab. We've got hostname through R3, etc. But I don't see the address. And the thing is, the interface, the loopbacks are always going to show near the top of the file or top of the config. So let's go ahead and run show run. And it's going to build our config. And let's see what we've got. So pretty much the same thing so far. And now you also see the serial 0 interface that I put on in the last video because I had not saved my work since then. And there's our loopback 0 interface. So there is a difference right now between our show start and our show run. Now we need to change that, and let's talk about one way we can do that. That's with the copy file, or excuse me, the copy command. And you really want to have the syntax of this one down cold. The great thing is it's very simple, very straightforward, and it is a command you're going to use pretty often. Now, you're going to use copy more often than you think, and you're not just going to use it for the run and start. We'll see all the options in a moment. It's not just a good idea to remember the command syntax, though. It's a fantastic idea for a multiple choice exam, because the first location that we name in the copy command is where we're copying from. The second location is where you're copying to. I remembered this. I usually don't go for too many tricks or anything, but when I was studying this, the way I remembered it at first is that F came before T. You know, from comes before to in the command. So if that works for you until you get used to it, beautiful, go ahead and use it. Just send me a nickel royalty every time you use it. Now, obviously, we're going to have very vastly different things happen if we get that backwards. You know, copy run start is copying the running config to the startup config. Copy start run is copying the startup config over the running config, and that's obviously not what we want to do. So again, the first value is where you're copying from. The second value is where you are copying to. Let's go ahead and do that right now and take a look at the syntax. Okay, that's a little unusual. We're getting a question mark and being told unrecognized command. Anytime you get this, and especially with a command that you know darn well you have right, and you know there's only so many ways to spell copy, so I know that I have this correct. It usually just means you're in the wrong config mode, and it's just habit to go to global configuration mode when you're ready to put in a command. But what we need to do is do the copy command from the enable prompt. A little unusual, so I wanted to make sure I showed that to you. Now, we've got an erase option. Let's leave the erase option alone for right now, but it is there. And notice again, every time you put a value in, the first one is from, the second one is to. And we can copy from all kinds of different things. We can also copy from NVRAM. We know what that is. There's our running config and startup config. And copy from TFTP, that is probably going to be the second most often used option with copy, is copying from TFTP, and we'll talk about why in just a moment. Now let's go ahead and just do a copy, and if we're copying run, and then we're copying that to the startup configuration. Note this time we're doing 2. So that would be it. Copy run start. If you want to type out the entire command, it would be copy running config startup config. Now this is what it's going to ask you, and you can just hit enter to accept that, because it is going to say, you know, what's the destination file name, and notice by default it's saying startup config, is that the one? And you just hit enter and you're good to go. So we're building the config. And then we'll run show start and make sure that it worked. And there they are now. There's the loopback interface, there's the serial interface from the last lab, the IP address and the encap that we put on there. So the copy has worked and everything is beautiful. Very simple command, just the first value is from, the second value is to. Now let's talk about the TFTP deal for just a moment, and how Cisco routers work very hard to save us all from embarrassment, to save us from ourselves, and we'll take that all we can get, and possible job loss. Let's say you're working overnight, you're configuring a router for a client, you work for hours and you forget to save your changes. You know, what if you decide to reload the router and you got a bunch of unsaved changes? What if you just have one, unsaved change? Well, the running config file, we know where that is. That's in RAM. We're going to lose that on the reload. The startup config file is in NVRAM, so we know that's going to be kept when we reload the router. So unsaved changes then would not be kept on a reload. That's probably bad. Now, the router is going to ask you a very important question if you attempt a reload and the running config is different from the startup config. And to illustrate that, let me change, we'll stick with router 3 since we're here. And let's just change the name to router 3. And we do that with the hostname command. We'll do it in uppercase just to annoy our admins and go from there. So I'm not going to save anything. And now I'm going to come back later and say, oh yeah, I need to reload that for such and such a reason. It's going to ask you, system configuration has been modified. Well, it's telling you that. Then it's just asking, save. And you think, well, maybe I need to look at show run. So if you're not sure, you could just say, well, what could you do? Because you've got yes, no. You've already done the reload process. So what you could do is just try to get out of it or hit enter, and you're going to have to answer yes or no. What do you want to do here? So let's say then that you're thinking, I really want to go back and look at the running config. I don't know what I'm saving. Because what if you do this? Here's another thought. One question always leads to another in networking. What if you're reloading a router on a weekend and you get that message? And you're not the one who did the changes. Let's say you came in at 9 a.m., you got this reload scheduled for 9 a.m., and you go in or you do this, and it's like, okay, what changes? So it would be a good idea to get out of this and then go look at the running config, right? You see what I'm saying? So I would say no in that case, but is there any way for me to get out of this? Let's find out. Yeah, there is a way, because it's going to prompt you, do you still want to reload the router? And of course, this is where you get in trouble if you just automatically hit enter, because it's going to confirm and go forward with it. So if you say no, then it goes to router 3, back to your prompt, and you are saved. And then you could do a show run. So having had that happen to me once, it's like a flashback. It's like, wait a minute, I remember when this happened. But it's a little scary, and it can be a little scary even in a lab, because sometimes if you're working in a lab and you get up and you're out for the day or you're out for a couple of days or whatever, and you come back, it's like, okay, let's reload here. And you get asked that question, hey, did you want to save your changes? If your answer to that is what changes, then you should probably just get out of it and say no. Don't save the changes and do not proceed with the reload. Now, let's say, though, that you do want the changes to be saved and you do want to go ahead and do the reload. Then I would say yes. And it's going to build the config, so it's saving the file. It's saving my changes. And it's saving my changes. And it says OK in the brackets. Then it's still going to ask you, do you want to proceed with the reload? So thankfully, there's no such thing as, you just reload, enter, and it goes. because we usually, so I know it gets annoying sometimes to be asked those things. You know, I've said to a computer more than once in my life, do you want to save these changes? No, I just made them because I don't want to save them. But when you're reloading a router, it is a good thing that we have a little bit of check thrown in there. So I would just confirm, and then the reload is requested, and then we just go from there. And that's really all there is to it. So there is a way to get out of that reload if you don't want to do it, because you are going to be prompted, and just say, no, I do not want to reload. And again, definitely bears repeating here. If you're asked about saving changes and your immediate response is, what changes? Don't save them. Get out of it. Say, no, I don't want to save. No, I don't want to reload. And then do a show run to see what those changes are. Excellent idea there. So let's see, I've got that in text for you here. And let's talk about the importance of keeping some extra copies of your configs for just a moment. Now today, especially in today's world of Carbonite, and I'm just mentioning them because I use them, but there are so many backup plans out there. You know, everybody's got it built in. You get an antivirus program, it's got a backup built in for a couple of extra bucks. There's no way you shouldn't have a backup of everything you own today. It's so easy. But there are some network admins out there, are some networks, particularly in smaller networks I've seen, where people aren't as diligent about keeping up-to-date backups of their router and switch configs as they should be. Now, larger networks tend to have it built into their plan. You know, at 907 we will back this up or whatever. But, you know, backing up the files and backing up the contents and backing up servers, that's all great. But you really should have an extra copy of all your router configs. And you might think, you know, why would I ever need that? You know, is it something that really goes away very often? Not terribly often, but I've seen a couple of situations where they come in handy. First off, you know, what if you were victim to an attack? You know, what if somebody got into your router and just did a write erase and then a reload, and then, you know, what do you do then? And of course, honest mistakes happen. You know, they happen. We're all human beings. And while this happens rarely, any file can become corrupt over time. Any file. So can a startup config file. It's just a great idea to have backups of these particular files. And you can actually save a router's config to the flash of another router if that router has enough space in its flash to hold it. No problem there if you have enough flash. But the most common method really is to use a TFTP server. And you'll notice I threw a couple of different devices in here that we could use as that. You could use a traditional server, you know, traditional white box or black box server, or you could use another router, you know, space permitting, or you could use your laptop. Again, there are plenty of free and almost free TFTP programs that just work tremendously. But again, it's just a really good idea to have backups of those particular configs. Now, again, you know, I just mentioned here, when you hear TFTP server, that can be just about anything. You know, it could be a laptop, it could be a Cisco router, and that's going to work beautiful. Now, you can get information about changing a router's iOS online. Cisco's got some great documentation on it. But just seeing it, just going real world here, sometimes updating an iOS is more of an art than a science. You know, sometimes it just goes beautifully, and on occasion it doesn't. And that's another reason you want backups of everything, just in case an iOS upgrade goes badly. Let's talk about that upgrading a router iOS for just a moment here, because I do get a lot of messages on this. A lot of people asking in Twitter, you know, hey, I want to get the latest and greatest iOS. How do I get it for my home router? Well, you probably have to give Cisco money. You can download new iOSs from Cisco's website, but just having the classic CCO online or your certification login or whatever, that's not enough. I'm not going to go into all the rules as to who can download iOSs and who can't, because they do change over time. But you can find out quickly on Cisco's website. It usually just depends, you know, did you buy the router from us? And that's understandable. With the used router market out there, there was a time when Cisco was trying to stomp on that, and I think they've kind of given up on that because they said, you know, the iOS is our property and you can't sell a device with that on it. So I think they've backed off on that. But my point here is for you that you can't just go out to Cisco's website anytime you want to and just download any iOS you want unless you've got a service contract with them. And again, once you get the iOS that you want, that file needs to be put on a TFTP server that the router has access to. And again, generally it's going to be your laptop, but I've done it from one router to another and it works beautifully. Here's another reason I'm bringing this up right now. If you do have to perform an iOS upgrade, you might be tempted to do it on the weekend. And of course, on the weekend, it's like, I don't want to drive in. I'll telnet in. That's what it's there for. I'll SSH in. Well, here's what I did to show you what happens if you try that. I telnetted into a router and issued the copy TFTP flash command. And of course, that means I'm copying from TFTP to the router's flash. And here's the warning I received on the very next screen. I definitely wanted to share this with you. This process will accept the copy options and then terminate the current system image to use the ROM-based image for the copy. Routing functionality will not be available during that time. That sounds bad. If you are logged in via Telnet, this connection will terminate. That's very bad if you're logged in with Telnet. Users with console access can see the results of the copy operation, and that's where, like when we see the iOS loading, we're hoping to see pound signs as something gets copied like that, or an iOS gets loaded anyway. As you might have guessed, I answered no and left the router up and running. And actually, a minute as the iOS is loaded, you'll actually see screens full of exclamation points. It looks like a massive ping, so you can end up with screens of exclamation points. Just as with the pound signs we saw earlier, if those exclamation points stop for a few seconds, that's okay. But if they stop and don't restart, then there's a problem with the copy. Once you do finish copying that iOS to flash, this is one of the rare occasions where you have to reload the router for the change to take effect. And before copying to flash, always do your homework and run show flash to see how much room you have left. And this is exactly how you do it. This particular output I have on the board for you shows that we don't have a whole lot of room left. So copying a new iOS image to this router without deleting the current one is just about impossible. Now, they're not going to ask you to upgrade any iOSs on the CCENT exam, anything like that at all. I'm really presenting most of this information to you at the end of this video for your real-world experience and your lab experience, because it is important for you. First off, you can't just get an iOS anytime you want it, but I definitely don't want you telnetting in and trying that particular upgrade, because it's not going to work. Now, what I'm going to do now is go set up another lab for us, a bit of a bonus lab here on the configuration register, because we're going to talk about it a little bit, but I want to show you some values and show you a couple of messages you may get. So I'm going to get an older router just in case I type the wrong number in. I'm sure we'll be fine, but I'm going to go ahead and set a router up with some of this, and instead of just discussing it for a few minutes, we'll see it in action. And I will see you with that as we wrap up this section in the very next video. See you there.